What should be the Democratic policy platform for the 2024 election? What should Kamala Harris propose? She's facing increased scrutiny in the press and increased pressure to release those policy proposals. And as I'm recording this, she's starting to release key parts of her economic policy. And what I want to do in this video is walk through what the rest of that policy could look like. And if you're watching this and you're a Republican, these ideas could apply equally to both sides of the aisle. And as I start, it's important to note that with few exceptions, voters don't care about actual policy. This is not the West Wing, but they do want to know, generally speaking, what are your values as a candidate and in what general direction you want to take the country. They also just want to know that you're a substantive person who's thought through these kinds of things. But if you're too specific, the voters will, hold you accountable for that. You can, create some inconvenient conversations like what's going on with this Project 2025 on the right. And you could see that, with Trump and Vance and the rest of the Republican field trying to distance themselves from this effort of a collection of prominent Republican think tanks who came out with a pretty detailed plan for what they would do after the election. And I think Trump and other Republican candidates don't want to own those specific policies. Now, the key in releasing a policy platform is to signal who you are, what your values are, what you care about. And the key is to do it in a way that surprises people, surprises the electorate. And because what you want to overcome is the certain expectations that people have of you. Because if you're a Democrat and you're saying, I just want to expand this program or that, people won't even remember that because they come to expect that from you. And the same is true of Republicans. If you're just saying, hey, I want to, cut taxes and cut regulations, then that alone isn't really going to get anybody's attention. It's not going to surprise anybody. An example of how this could work is what Trump did with the tax cuts on tips, like the no tax on tips. Now, on the face of it, it's a tax cut for Republicans, and so it shouldn't surprise the electorate. But it was surprising and reinforced certain values that Trump wanted to communicate to voters, namely that he is for the non-college educated worker, the so-called blue-collar workers and service industry workers, particularly in Nevada. And with that one proposal, as fiscally irresponsible and unworkable as I think it might be, actually set the terms of the debate in Nevada. The two Democratic senators in Nevada signed on to it. Kamala Harris wound up signing on to it. That's a way to use policy to communicate your values and dictate the terms of the debate. And we'll link in the show notes to the GOP platform that they released during their convention. And what you'll see is it's not really a policy platform. It's kind of a series of bullet point values and aspirations. It's not very specific, and it contains 20 of those bullet points. And, if you want to get a sense of the level of generality, number one on their list is, for example, quote, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. Now, it doesn't describe how they're going to seal the border, how they're going to stop the migrant invasion, as they call it. It also doesn't explain what they would do differently than, say, the GOP bill that the GOP senators and Biden agreed to that Trump opposed. So, like, what would he do differently? Number 6 on their list is a large tax cut for workers and no tax on tips. Now, the no tax on tips thing is more specific than the first part of that, but doesn't say how they would pay for it, how they would make up for the revenue shortfall. The large tax cut for workers doesn't say, for instance, what's the wage cutoff, what kind of tax cut, how much, how they would pay for it, etc. So you get the picture. Like the level of detail here is not what you would expect from a policy platform. Now, you could compare that to the 2008 Democratic platform for Barack Obama, which is really detailed, really long, and you'll see that over time, these platforms have gotten shorter, and for better or worse. And it's not clear that the 2008 Democratic platform was that helpful anyway, because if you read it, a lot of what's in there didn't wind up getting passed anyway. So the short story here is, people don't come to expect anymore a lot of detail on policy from their candidates for president, especially in part maybe because people are cynical and they know that you can't get a lot done in Washington right now. So they just kind of want to know your values. They want to know your story. But with that said, I do think Harris could take this opportunity to reinforce certain things that she wants to reinforce about herself. For instance, that she's thinking about the future, that she's a different kind of Democrat. I think she wants to say that she's moderate. And she could also show people that she's prepared. And to start this conversation, I want to start, with an area that's near and dear to my heart as a former school principal, which is education, both K-12 and higher education. And earlier today, I had a conversation with Todd Rose from an organization called Populous, which actually has, they do a certain kind of sophisticated polling for both people on the right and the left and everything in between. And basically what he tries to do is get through to people's actual preferences for policy and other things. And I asked him about policy specific to education, and here's what he had to say.
What you see when we think about education, because it's a profound gatekeeper of opportunity. We're like, everybody go to college. And it's like, listen, that's not what people want. It doesn't mean, listen, I think college should be available to everyone, but it shouldn't be the only option to a good middle-class life. And that's, I think, what people are deeply frustrated by. So all the conversation about things like paying off student loans and things like that, it really reads as pretty profoundly unfair to a lot of people, because it's like, wait, you're not holding the universities responsible for their part of it, right? It's the equivalent of sort of a moral hazard, right? You're the same way you bail out banks and they're just going to engage in bad behavior again. You're bailing out universities essentially here, and people see that for what it is. What they want is like opportunity pluralism, right? Like, I want the widest range of possibilities for me, for my kid, as possible. And so the more that we elevate the dignity and worth of the full spectrum of careers in this society, the better off we'll be, and the more resonant we will be with the electorate.
So what Todd is saying here is that people, they still believe in a meritocracy. They want a path to success in life, and they want multiple different paths. Separate data that Todd has put out over the years suggests that people want alternatives to traditional higher education. They want career and technical education as well. So with that, here are some proposals that I think Harris could put out specific to education and related to education. One is on the question of loan forgiveness, which is something that Todd and I actually talked about in our conversation. And right now, the Democratic policy on loan forgiveness was to do a blanket forgiveness for everybody. And they were smacked down by the courts, weren't able to do that. And I think the critique of the loan forgiveness, in addition to the legal critique, was that it was focused only on the college-educated voters that Democrats tend to do well with, and does nothing for the non-college educated workers. And actually, the non-college educated workers are actually subsidizing people to get any kind of degree. What would I do about this? Well, I would, if I were Harris, I would propose a national service program that gives full loan forgiveness, but only to people who do certain jobs: doctors, nurses, teachers, domestic care workers, and other careers that are in short supply, that are essential folks for American society. Because right now we're facing scarcity of jobs that everybody depends upon. The AAMC says that we're facing an 86,000 doctor shortage by 2036. There's a 2023 study that found from 2008 to 2019, the number of Medicaid-covered patients seeking home care increased from 2 million to more than 3.2 million. And so what we're seeing here is that we have a larger number of retirees entering the entering retirement age than ever before, and probably than we'll ever will have. We don't have people to take care of them at home. We don't have people to take care of them at hospitals and nursing homes. And if Harris said, hey, we're going to actually look ahead to the future and prioritize those folks for loan forgiveness, and then on the non-college front, throw in some kind of equivalent program to subsidize and support people who do critical jobs in trades that also face short supply. So, for instance, in certain parts of the country, we have critical shortages of plumbers, carpenters, welders, people who are doing jobs that don't necessarily require college education. And so in that case, instead of doing loan forgiveness, we could do loans to people to start their own businesses and undergo non-college training in those areas. I would also include, as part of this service program, a new category of job, which essentially is a social care worker for the elderly to help cure part of the loneliness and socialization problems that people have when they enter older age. There are certain countries like Singapore who do this. So essentially creating a new job for young people to essentially hang out with older people. I would also pair people from different parts of the country. So I would either take people from red and blue states and pair them together to do service together, or I would take people from rural areas and I would place them in urban areas, and I would take people from urban areas and I would place them in rural areas as a way to get people exposure to people who are different from them. I went through this. I started a school in Mississippi, and it was so important for me to spend time and in service of people from a place that was so different from Staten Island, New York, where I grew up. And, if Harris or Trump proposes something like this, what they can do is reinforce a message of unity, and that they actually want to cut through this polarization and geographical segregation that we have right now that's making it harder and harder to get anything done and see the humanity in people who are different from us. I would pair everything I just described with a massive expansion in technical education. I would set a goal like, for instance, let's establish 1,000 new technical high schools in this country. And what I mean by technical education, it reminds me of something that Nehru did in India. He was the first prime minister of India, and his probably most, memorable legacy is that he created what are called IITs, which are technical universities and colleges all throughout India. I had some uncles who attended those. I would do that at the high school level here in the United States, and it could be certain super skilled high schools, like at Duval High School in Maryland, which has an aerospace program in partnership with NASA, which basically gets people experience in aviation, or what Indiana is doing, which Indiana has this career scholarship program where kids can use funds to find apprenticeships in all kinds of jobs, whether they're college-type skilled jobs like nursing or in medicine or in some of the trades that don't require college. And so what I would do is I would set a goal to dramatically expand those high schools and fund either states to do it or have direct run federal schools, which is something we don't have enough of. And what the latter allows us to do is actually have federal boarding schools. And if you think about this, fancy rich people, it's almost like the pinnacle of educational experience to send your kid to one of these fancy boarding schools. We have a lot of them in the Northeast of the United States. And they get to live in this fancy campus and get all the support that you can get and camaraderie that you get and extracurricular support from being in that type of environment. What I would do is I would set up these federal boarding schools that are, to use the language of Todd Rose, that reinforce the meritocracy, they're highly selective, and that accomplish different things. So you could have one in the health sciences, you could have one in the arts, you could have one with, the equivalent of like what Ballatieri was doing in Florida for sports. And this would change the conversation. And then these schools would be available to people in all 50 states. So that if you grew up in Wyoming, where there aren't many options, or you grew up in West Virginia, you can access a really high quality boarding school for free if your child achieves at the right level. A few more things I would do on K-12 education. I would pave the way for competency-based learning. So this is the equivalent of saying, all right, to what Todd is saying, parents want almost like a bespoke experience within the educational system. Like if their kid is accelerated, they want their kids to be met at the accelerated level that they're at. And if their kids are struggling, they want their kids to have more support. And this is really hard to do within the traditional system where you move forward in lockstep in groups of 30, where essentially unless something really horrible is going on or you're so exceptional that you're the 0.001%, you're not getting a lot of targeted support. You're basically being treated exactly the same based on your age, and it makes it really hard for teachers because they have to differentiate with 30 people in the classroom. And so what a lot of parents are asking for, and what technology allows us to do now, is to say, all right, like you may be on a 12th grade level in math, but you may be in a 9th grade level in reading, and we're going to differentiate you, and you're not in any one grade necessarily, but you're moving forward or or staying back on a given area of content based on your actual needs. And if you graduate early, you graduate early. If it takes longer, it takes longer, and it may be different depending on the skill. I would also reform schools of education to make them more content specific as opposed to more generalizable. I would embrace micro schools and deregulate daycare so that we can create more small school models throughout the country, so that we don't just have schools of 400 people, but that we have smaller learning environments that can look a little different, like surf skate science in Florida, or a school that some members of our team over at the branch visited in Tennessee, which is on a farm in Tennessee, which teaches kids all about agriculture. Um, I, I, my instinct is to say that a national candidate should endorse a national cell phone ban in schools, which is a growing movement within schools based on the work of Jonathan Haidt and others. But I'm a little reluctant to fully advocate for that because there's so much bipartisan momentum right now to ban cell phones in schools that I almost worry that a national candidate advocating for that would ruin it. I would support an expansion of charter schools. As Todd was describing, like in our interview, parents want more school choice. He found something like in a study coming up this fall, he found something like 80% of families want more school choice within the system. And charter schools, which are mostly nonprofit public schools run independent of school districts, are getting incredible results. We'll link in the show notes to a study from Credo, which is an outfit of Stanford University, which is the gold standard in study of charter schools, which both sides of the charter school debate cite this study. They show that charter schools, particularly urban charter schools, are dramatically outperforming other school models, including traditional school models. I would also do some work on the childcare supply side, because right now there is a huge demand for childcare that's driving up the prices, and there's a huge amount of scarcity. So what we need to do is provide more seats within child care providers. And I would do, number one, I would provide grants to states to dramatically expand training and business coaching for people to start new child care facilities and expand the amount of seats that they have. And I would also incentivize states to clear licensing hurdles so that we can make it easier for people to start childcare, to open up more seats for childcare. And I had a conversation on the Lost Debate podcast with a reporter from Reason magazine who just chronicled all the different regulatory burdens, for instance, in Washington, D.C., where it just makes it really, really hard to start and expand a child care provider there, and hence, a scarcity makes it more expensive for a lot of people. A lot of people just simply can't find child care. And sort of moving out of education, on the sort of the point about surprising the electorate, I would, if I were a Democrat, I would find ways to deregulate in a way that fits within your progressive values. And I think a good model for this is Jared Polis in Colorado, who has pushed all kinds of deregulation, including areas, for instance, of occupational licensing. Like a good example here is that, in a lot of states, barbers need a specialized license. And in a lot of cases, there are barriers to entry of people coming out of the prison system to be barbers, for example. And this, prompts, a lot of questioning to like, well, if we're letting people out of the prison system, we want them to integrate in society. And if they can't do jobs like barbers, like what do we expect them to do? How do we expect them to integrate into society? And if they can't integrate into society, why are we surprised then if they commit further crimes? We'll link in the show notes to an article from Reason, which talked about, just the massive growth in licensing hurdles for people to enter the workforce. And that's just one example, but I just think like whenever you are a Democrat, instead of just expanding programs, but actually cutting through the red tape and decreasing the size of government as a way to allow people to realize their opportunity, that's a good thing. And that's actually what undergirds what Mayor Eric Adams in New York is trying to do with the so-called City of Yes. On the transportation side of things, what I would do is I would expand high-speed rail and other infrastructure, but try to do it in a way that reinforces unity. And this may be too hokey, and you're probably rolling your eyes at this particular idea, but I would, for instance, do a grant program where I prioritize high-speed rail from red states to blue states, right? Like, and you could use whatever, indicator you want, rural to non-rural or whatever. Like a good example would be Nevada, which I think is currently run by Republicans, Nevada to, Vegas to LA, right? And it's hokey and it's probably inefficient, but what it says is, our infrastructure is not just going to be about cities. It's going to be about rural and suburban areas. And I do want to acknowledge that the existing infrastructure work that Biden is doing does a lot of that. But this would just be a way to communicate it very clearly to people that this is really what you're about, and in many ways rhymes with the national service proposal that I had before. On the inflation front, there's a lot that could be done here. I would tackle housing, healthcare, education as three critical areas where inflation is particularly debilitating to families. Now, some people like Jared Polis, who I mentioned, the Colorado governor, have simple immigration plans. He says he wants to increase immigration and oppose tariffs. And what this does is, increasing immigration means that we have more people to do more jobs, which decreases the wage inflation and the cost of services. On tariffs, by opposing tariffs, you decrease the cost of goods, because tariffs, no matter what you think about them, generally speaking, increase the cost of goods. Let me put Polis's proposal aside for a second, because I don't think that that's politically workable for somebody like Harris, who wants to lean into a little bit of populism. What are some things I would do? One is I would have something to say about the interest rates right now. It always struck me as odd that we have one Fed rate policy, right? So if you're a corporation borrowing or you're somebody trying to purchase a home, you're both subject to the federal, the Fed's interest rate monetary policy. What I would do if I were Harris, and Trump could do this too, is have a different policy for first-time home buyers, and maybe even just anybody who has a primary residence and no other homes. I would say, for you, we're going to have a consistent federal interest rate that's subsidized by the government, or that's just capped by the government. And let's say that we'll make funds available for that at a 3% interest rate or whatever, right? What this does is it, first of all, it unlocks the supply side, because now people will feel more comfortable selling their homes because they, some of these people were locked into 3% rates or whatever, are afraid to sell their homes because they don't want to enter the market at the rates that we're at now. But also, it obviously would make the market more accessible to people who want to buy homes who can't afford the 6% rate or whatever it is right now. But what it also does is it communicates to the electorate that you're for fairness, and that people who are entering the housing market aren't just going to be subject to the arbitrary timeline of when they happen to enter. If you entered a few years ago, you get 3%. If you enter a year ago, you get 7%. That doesn't seem fair to people. So what you're saying is, I want to create fairness and predictability within the housing market. One more thing on higher education. I mentioned a little bit of higher education before. I would remove the tax-exempt status from colleges that don't expand the number of seats and drive down their costs. This gets to the meritocracy. This gets to the sort of American dream point, which is, if you're about the future and you're Harris, what you want to say is you want to decouple this view that Democrats and liberals are creatures of higher education as it currently exists. And you want to say, we actually want to reform the system. We want to, some of the other things I said before would kind of push higher education in the direction of the jobs that are actually in short supply right now, make it more practical. But actually leveraging the tax-exempt statuses of universities to push them to expand seats turns them into these sort of elite private clubs that they are right now, and says, actually, they're here to serve the common interests of everybody. And what I would also do is I would include incentives for schools to offer some of those seats that exist to non-traditional students, particularly older applicants who are making career changes. And what that allows you to do is to have something to say about this sort of AI, automation, trade-related job losses that are happening, and allows people to actually re-enter the higher education system and train for jobs of the future or that are in short supply. I would also allow kids to enroll in professional schools straight from high school. So there are different ways the federal government can incentivize this, and I don't need to go into them here, but I would say, all right, let's create more pathways so kids can enter medical school. Like my dad, who grew up in India, entered medical school at 17, right? Let's get more people into those jobs now. Even law, which I don't think is necessarily an area of like national concern, except for certain areas like increased asylum officers, et cetera, and judges. But I would say, all right, enter these professions earlier. But what that does is it decreases the overall cost of a degree, so you don't need all those extra years of undergrad. But it also gets people into those jobs faster, which means that we have more people doing those jobs. On the healthcare front, Jacob Hacker earlier this week had a great article about how in 2019, Harris had a plan to allow Americans to buy into Medicare. Essentially, that's, I think that's a pretty good plan because healthcare is a huge driver of inflation and out-of-pocket costs for Americans. And we could do a whole video on why allowing people to buy into Medicare could be sensible policy. But what that does is allow people to keep their private insurance, but also for people who can't afford private insurance, which is a nightmare, especially if you're self-employed or you're between jobs. Allow them to buy into Medicare, which creates a little bit of cost pressure on the system and real competition. On the spending side of things, there's a lot of different things you could do here. One example is to pick an area of spending and set a real target to cut that spending. And in this case, I would pick military spending. The U.S. spends 3 times its closest adversary, which is China, on military spending. I would pick a target and say within 10 years, we're going to cut whatever, maybe a third, maybe you can get as high as a half, right? And we would still be spending more than any of our adversaries by a long shot on the military. And you could have more to say about this. You could say we're going to cut certain dumb projects. We're going to use less government contractors. We're going to create a true competitive bidding process, whatever, fewer, aircraft carriers and, fighter jets that sit, unused, whatever. Like you can have a whole policy rollout on that. I'm going to skip the taxes side of things because that can be its whole video. And I know that Harris is rolling out policy on that this week. On the immigration side of things, I would basically support the bipartisan GOP-led immigration bill that Trump killed, which is essentially what Harris is saying. But I would add to it a dreamer fix for the dreamers, and I would also add an expansion for high-skilled workers, a dramatic expansion. So we're bringing in people to do the jobs that are in short supply and that we want in this country. Like we want more doctors, we want more engineers, right? And potentially an expansion of people who want to do the domestic care work that I was talking about before. On the democracy front, I would ban the revolving door so people can't leave the administration or Congress and work in the areas that they've been regulating. I would ban partisan gerrymandering, and I would make that a Supreme Court litmus test because in some ways you need the Supreme Court to bless that. I would do the same for caps on donations to campaigns, whether it's soft money or hard money. I would say, all right, you can only give $500 or $1,000 to a campaign. And I would also make that a litmus test for Supreme Court justices because you're going to need Supreme Court justices to back you up on that. I would ban congressional stock trading, and the same is true of political appointees within government. I would increase pay for judges and for members of Congress in exchange for term limits, which obviously communicates that you're this younger person in Harris, and you're somebody who is communicating that we need a continued refreshing of the leadership that we have. We need to constantly bring in new people, whether they're young or old, just newer people into jobs, whether it's judges or members of Congress. And at the same time, we want to compensate them so that there's less of a pull to make money in other ways, whether it's by trading stocks or taking other jobs or signing lucrative book deals. I'll stop there because I can go through other, areas of policy like climate change, et cetera. This is not meant to be comprehensive. You should use the comment section of this video to just propose your own ideas, and maybe we'll do a follow-up video on this. Thank you very much.